Mixed Up World by Nick Sheptek. The story that follows contains vivid depictions of violence and assault that may be unsuitable for some readers. These depictions are not meant to glorify or glamorize the actions of the characters. They exist solely to serve the story. Reader discretion is advised. Chapter 1. The last thing he remembered was dancing. It was his wedding. Everything had been perfect. After nearly 10 years together, they had finally done it. The reception was electric. The energy on the dance floor was exhilarating. He didn't care how hard his knee was throbbing. It was the best day of his life. He was dancing. Then, nothing. Blackness. Like when you're in the middle of a song and decide to skip to the next. There was that brief silence during the transition. Suddenly he was being whipped through a dream that wasn't his. Before he could wrap his mind around what he was seeing, it slipped through his fingers, and he slowly returned to reality. His eyes were still closed, but he could tell something was off. He could feel it against his skin. It was the bed, the sheets. They were the nicest he'd ever touched, like being wrapped in a cloud while snuggled by an angel. He could have laid there forever and ignored the fact that everything felt off. He could have kept his eyes closed and delayed things as long as possible. Instead, he opened them and confirmed what he was feeling in the pit of his stomach. The room he was in was one he had never seen before, one he didn't belong in. He blinked a few times, expecting his surroundings to change, to become someplace familiar like the hotel suite he and his new wife were supposed to retire to after the reception. The reception. He couldn't remember how it ended. He couldn't remember anything about it after the dancing. Every wedding goes on long after the reception, usually at the nearest bar. He had no recollection of the party continuing at a bar or any place else after the reception. His memory was a black hole. Had he been that drunk? His knee wasn't even bothering him. It had been sending shockwaves throughout his body that not even a wedding amount of alcohol could mask just moments ago. It always hurt in the morning, especially after a night of activity. It should have been knives. Instead, it felt better than it had since before he heard it playing football back in high school. There was no pain at all. He was about to look down beneath the covers to check on his knee when he heard breathing behind him that wasn't his wife's. He forgot all about the knee. He'd slept beside her long enough to know the sound of her breathing in her sleep, the way you know every beat of your favorite song. Despite her being the doctor, she was the one who almost always woke up first. As far back as he could remember, he always loved those 5 to 10 minutes between waking up and getting out of bed. He liked to lay on his back, looking up at the ceiling, and just be. For years, her breathing had been the soundtrack to those moments. He rolled over to find the next on an ever-growing list of strange occurrences. The person in bed with him was indeed not his new wife. All he could see was the short, cropped black hair on the back of the man's head. But he could tell it was a man by the solid structure of his build from the neck up. Could he have gotten so drunk at his wedding that he went to bed with a man? Was this some sort of joke being played on him by his wife, or maybe his friends? Ridiculous thought. None of that was even remotely possible. This was something else. Whatever it was beginning to terrify him. He felt a wave of anxiety throughout his body. Something was wrong. He rolled back over and slid off the bed, careful not to disturb the sleeping mystery man. The feeling of cold air on his body let him know he was naked. He would have looked down had he not been so entranced by the room, a room that he now truly was taking in for the first time. It certainly was not a room at the boutique hotel in Cincinnati where the wedding was being held. It wasn't even a hotel room. It was a bedroom, a classy, minimalist bedroom. Someone very wealthy lives here, he thought. His eyes scanned the room. A king-sized bed, a dresser, a vanity, a crimson velvet floor-to-ceiling curtain stretching across the entire wall before him, all of it of high quality and pristine condition. He reached out to open the curtain, but his hands stopped once he caught a glimpse of them. They weren't the large, strong, coarse working man's hands he'd known his entire adult life. They were small, dainty, and well manicured. They were women's hands. Finally, He looked down and nearly fainted at what he saw. He was no longer a he. There were no words or thoughts. His mind a blank slate. There was also no explanation. Somehow his strong, athletic, late-20s male body had been replaced by that of a thin, yet fit young woman, probably in her early 20s. His new, unscarred, and undamaged knees buckled. A wave of nausea far worse than the anxiety he was already feeling tore through him. There were 2 doors, one on the wall opposite the curtain, another in the corner a few feet away from the foot of the bed. He went with his nauseous gut to the one on the opposite wall and opened it to find a bathroom. He had just enough wherewithal to close the door before dropping to his new knees and emptying the contents of his new stomach into the toilet. There wasn't much in there to begin with. Even so, it all came out. Once the vomiting ceased, he remained hunched over the toilet trying to catch his breath and get his thoughts right. What the hell is going on? He spit the last bits of bile out, then stood up and stumbled over to the sink while keeping his eyes on the tile. He wasn't ready to see. He ran the water and washed his mouth clean before taking a few gulps. The water flowing down his throat brought to his attention the fact that he was hungover. He had been too confused to notice. Now he couldn't stop chugging the tap water. The same thought kept rattling his brain. What the hell is going on? Eventually, he had enough. He shut off the tap, then closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was going to have to see what was being reflected in the mirror sooner or later. No sense in prolonging it. His head tilted up to face the mirror. He held it there with his eyes closed. His hands gripped the counter. It's gonna be okay. 3, 2, 1... He opened his eyes and for the first time took in the body he was now inhabiting. She couldn't have been older than 22. Absolutely stunning. Pale, flawless skin, perfect teeth. Marble blue eyes you could disappear into and never return. Short, blonde hair cut in the flapper style of the 1920s. Tight and toned body. The kind of woman people dream about being with. But he wasn't with her. He was her. And he had no clue in hell what was happening. At least 10 minutes had passed since he opened his eyes to his new reality. He hadn't moved. All he could do was stand still as a statue staring at the strange yet beautiful face staring back. His hands probed the naked flesh of his new body in search of some sort of escape hatch back to reality. When nothing worked, he tried talking himself out of it. Your name is Chris Bordner. You live in Shelby, North Carolina. You just got married. Your wife is probably in your hotel room waiting for you. You're going to Tahiti. Your name is Chris. This is not real. This can't be real. Your name is Chris. You are a man. He kept telling himself he was still dreaming. But he knew that wasn't the case. This was real. He didn't know how, but it was real. Violent screams suddenly blasted through the wall from the bedroom, yanking him from his introspection. Now he knew he wasn't dreaming. No one could continue sleeping through those howls. It was the most ear-shattering sound he'd ever heard. Was someone being tortured? His confusion gave way to fear. There was no telling who or what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. He looked around, and the best he could do was a blow-dryer. He picked it up, wrapped the cord around his thin, feminine wrist, and raised his arm in preparation to strike before opening the door. As the door opened, he lost the only barrier between him and the screaming. It had been disturbing. Now it was deafening. What he saw was something that would keep him up at night for years to come. The earth-shattering, ear-splitting, time-stretching, space-cracking scream was coming from the man who had previously been asleep in bed with him. The man was now awake. He was on his back, kicking and thrashing and crying and wailing like an infant. Chris dropped the blow-dryer and watched in horror while trying to make sense of the sight. A handsome, muscular man in his mid to late 20s, naked on his back, kicking and screaming like a baby, desperate to be fed. Finally, it began to dawn on Chris what had happened. What was happening. As unbelievable as it seemed, it was the only explanation. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to say or even think it. Then the man in the bed began to wet himself. Since he was naked, the urine sprayed everywhere, barely missing Chris as it went straight up and splashed back down on and all around the man in the bed. Chris had seen enough. He looked around on the floor and saw a smattering of various clothing. He fumbled around, scooping up everything that looked like it would fit his new body, then left the room and closed the door. He could still hear the screaming and thrashing, but the closed door cut it a bit. Before he could get dressed, he caught a glimpse of the room he was now in and dropped the clothes. He was in the main living space of the nicest high-rise condo he had ever seen. The furniture, the decorations, the art on the walls, everything about this place was from a world he had only seen in the movies or on TV. The woman whose body he now inhabited came from some otherworldly money. On the far end were floor-to-ceiling windows spanning the length of the wall. Through them, he could see the most stunning view of London. He slowly walked across the room until he could put his new hands on the window. It was vibrating. He stared in awe. He had never been to London, but he knew Big Ben, the Tower Bridge, and the other famous sights when he saw them. Once the shock of his new location on the other side of the world wore off, he took a closer look. What he saw just told him that his biggest fear was likely true. The scene just outside the window was one of pure chaos. The streets were full of car wrecks and confused, wandering people who were clearly experiencing the same phenomenon as he. Even more concerning was all the fire and smoke both close and in the distance. One such fire was close enough that he could see what had caused it. A plane had fallen from the sky and hit multiple buildings on its way down before landing in the middle of a street. The jet fuel had exploded from its tanks and caused scattered fires all around. Fires that were growing and spreading with each passing second. The crash must have been loud. Chris wondered why he hadn't heard it, then assumed it may have been what woke him up. The rapid growth and spread of the fires were alarming, especially since they were heading in his direction. It was only a matter of time before they reached his building. Even more disturbing was the mass of bodies littering the path of the plane crash. Hundreds, easily. The building just across the street was already up in flames. He could feel the heat through the glass, yet hear no sounds. Must be soundproof, he thought. Probably why I didn't hear the crash. Then he noticed something in one of the windows. A man, coughing and waving smoke away as he repeatedly smashed the window with a chair, first causing it to crack, then spiderweb, then shatter. The glass falling at least 20 stories to the ground where it showered the chaos. The man across the street wasted no time in sticking his head out, breathing in the air and surveying the landscape. For a split second, Chris swore the man looked right at him. A moment later, he was climbing out of the window and jumping to his death. Dazed, Chris stumbled back from the window. He could not believe it, nor could he deny it. This was really happening. It was happening everywhere, to everyone. He regained his bearings, crossed the room to the pile of clothes, found some that worked, and got dressed as quickly as he could. Jeans, t-shirt, sweater. A usually simple task made difficult by the uncontrollable trembling that racked his entire body. He could still hear the wailing from the bedroom, but tried to ignore it. He didn't have time to deal with the mind of an infant in the body of a grown man. There was nothing he could do for him anyway. After tying the laces on the designer sneakers, he scanned the room and quickly found what he was looking for, a designer purse. He tore it open and found a phone. He didn't even bother to check the ID to learn the name of the person whose body he now inhabited. The phone was unlocked via facial recognition. Finally a break, he thought. He dialed the number of his cell phone and prayed it would be answered. After 3 rings, it was. The confused voice on the other end was his. He'd heard it via enough recordings over the years to recognize it. There was only one problem. It was speaking a very frantic Japanese. Other panicked voices could be heard in the background, a cacophony of different voices and languages blending together loud and chaotic. There was no point in trying to talk to himself. It wasn't even himself, just his body, his voice, not his mind. not even the mind of the woman whose body he now inhabited. He hung up. He considered calling his wife's phone, but what would be the point? It wouldn't be her. What the hell was he going to do? He didn't want to step outside into the chaos, but he didn't want to stay in the condo with the screaming baby man and the impending fire. His thoughts were interrupted by knocking at the door. No, not knocking. Pounding. Loud, angry pounding. Whoever was on the other side wasn't stopping to say hi or deliver a welcome to your new reality basket, and they weren't letting up. He opened the purse again and once again found what he was looking for, a taser. He took it out, armed, and tested it. Then he slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side was someone in the body of a young woman, roughly the same size as he was in his new body. Despite her angry yelling in a language that he did not recognize nor understand and relentless pounding, Chris felt like she wasn't much of a threat. His body relaxed, and he dropped the hand holding the taser to his side before wrapping his other tiny new hand around the doorknob and twisting it. It had been a mistake to judge the woman by her physique. She immediately pounced on Chris, knocking the taser from his hand while screaming in that unknown language. Having been both a wrestler and football player in high school before the knee injury, Chris used some old moves to escape, but his attacker was relentless. She kept coming, so he kicked her in the stomach. She stumbled back a few steps before muttering something unintelligible, then looked around and saw a flower vase within reach. She grabbed it, dumped the flowers, and lunged at Chris. He had been too busy staring at the angry woman to act. While she was reaching for the vase, he could have been scrambling for the taser, but he missed his moment and was now trying to dodge the heavy glass cylinder being swung at his head. After 3 whiffed swings, the angry woman threw the vase at Chris. He ducked and rolled along the floor, a move that would have caused severe pain in his old knee. While recovering from the roll, he decided that he needed to go on the attack. He also needed a weapon, but it was too late. This realization hit him with the force of 50,000 volts on the back of his neck as the angry woman had picked up the taser while Chris wasn't looking and used it against him. He fell to the ground like an old man whose legs gave out. Then he felt it again, this time in his stomach. Once he was a teenager, he and some friends had taken a shock collar off his friend Jeff's dog. They took turns holding it against various parts of their bodies and walked across the invisible fence line. Typical stupid teenage boy behavior. That had hurt, but in a funny way. The shock of the taser made the jolts of the collar feel like a friendly tickle. The pain was relentless. It caused him to writhe and thrash. He convulsed and spasmed so hard he thought he might snap his spine clean in half. Just as he felt the life begin to fade from his frail new body, he summoned whatever strength he had left, and in a last desperate fit of pained rage, he managed to knock the taser away. But it was only a temporary respite from the pain, as he was too weak to do anything else. The angry woman didn't bother to chase down the taser. Instead, she jumped on top of Chris and used her knees to pin his arms to the floor. Then she wrapped her frail hands around his thin neck and pressed with all her weight. "So this is how I die," was all he could think. He didn't want to look, but was unable to close his eyes. It didn't matter. Within seconds, they began to lose focus. The only thing he saw now was his wife's face. Maybe she was dead too. Perhaps a plane landed on her. Or maybe she had been on a plane, screaming in confused terror as it fell from the sky. If she was dead, he hoped she would be waiting for him wherever he was going. His body went limp, and he embraced the cold, dark abyss of death. Death didn't embrace him back. He didn't even see it since he was barely conscious. He felt the hands fall from his throat. His hands, now freed, immediately reached for the same throat that clawed at it just until it reopened and air flooded in. His eyes shot open just in time to see a very large, muscular man bashing what was left of the angry woman's face into the corner where 2 walls met, leaving a trail of blood, brains, and skull in its wake. Finally, with no head left to smash, he let the body fall to the ground in a heap of flesh and bone before turning his attention to Chris, who was still on the floor trying to make sense of what was happening. There was a look of adrenaline-fueled rage in the man's eyes as he started to walk toward Chris. He was massive, with arms covered in elaborate, colorful tattoos that Chris's still unfocused eyes could not discern. Chris couldn't tell what this man's intent was. He started to slide backward across the carpeted floor, his hands reaching back and briefly feeling for a potential weapon before rotating back to push his body further away. The man was standing right over him when the gates of hell opened. The ground shook from a massive explosion in the building across the street, followed by its collapsing. The force of the explosion shattered the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, letting in all the sounds and smells from the outside. The screaming was deafening. The smoke was choking. It wouldn't be long before the flames crossed the street and engulfed this building. Smoke inhalation would kill Chris and the massive man long before the flames could. He had nearly escaped death moments ago, only to find it staring him in the face yet again. Chris's eyes turned back to the massive man who was coughing and gasping for air. It took a moment for his body to adapt to its new conditions. Then, as if on command, his entire disposition changed. His large, ripped body suddenly relaxed. The massive muscles that had been tense and ready for action released themselves. It was as if he was awakening from a trance. He was an absolute statue, 6'5", with a rock-solid muscular physique and those bright, intricate tattoos blanketing each arm. It was clear that the new inhabitant was not used to piloting such an impressive piece of hardware. Whomever was in there was visibly in shock at what he or she had just done. They trembled while staring at the lifeless corpse while trying to catch their breath. Oh my God. Did I do that? The man flexed and admired his massive new biceps for a moment. Then he looked from the dead body to Chris, then to the scene outside, and appeared to be struck with a realization. English? The man asked. Chris nodded. Yeah. Oh, thank God. We need to go. Now. They held out their hand to Chris. What? Why? Who are you? Don't you hear that? Smell that? Only getting worse. Them fires ain't stopping. It's like only a matter of time before the reach us. So you coming? Chris knew that whoever was inside the body did not match the person he was seeing. What's your name? The man's body standing over Chris hesitated as if he had forgotten his own name. Megan. And according to this ID, this guy is Victor. Megan ran her hands along her new chest, examining and admiring it. And, whoever he, was, he was fit. Either way, he, may have been a Victor, but you can just call me Megan. She held out her massive new man hand. Chris took it as she pulled him up. They lingered a beat as Chris shook the massive first baseman's glove of a hand that dwarfed his. I'm Chris. Let's go. Megan handed Chris the taser. Here, take this. You're gonna need it. Right. They started to leave when Megan stopped. What about him? Referring to the baby man in the bedroom. The wailing was almost drowned out by the chaos outside, yet still loud enough to be heard amongst it. As much as Chris would have liked to help the poor bastard, he knew it was a lost cause. He couldn't speak the words, so he simply shook his head. Megan, all 6'5" and 250 carved out of marble pounds of her, nodded. She raised the cricket bat she'd been holding the whole time that Chris was now noticing for the first time. Follow me, and I guess be ready to use that thing. The sights, sounds, and smells of the streets of London were far worse than what Chris had observed from the window. It was beyond chaos. It was hell on earth. He kept reminding himself that he wasn't himself. The old him, the real him, would have felt somewhat confident in his ability to fight through the madness, even with the bum knee. The new him needed to be careful, be protected. He was glad he had Megan and the new body she was wearing to fill that role. He observed her as they stepped into the street. She seemed to steer her massive new frame with something of a forced awkwardness. At first, she might make a strong, confident move in one direction. Then she would slip or stumble or stop to awkwardly process the situation before trying her best to adjust and adapt. She was visibly happy with the new body, especially compared to the new realities many people were now finding themselves in. She was also visibly unsure how to properly operate it. Wrecked cars lined and filled the streets in all directions, some empty, many with bodies hunched over steering wheels or splayed out half on the hood with the other half still in the car. Their heads cracked open like pumpkins with the inside spilling out, blood running from the hood to the asphalt and streaming in all directions. Chris vomited from the sights, sounds, and smells that were all around him. It was overwhelming. All the sink water he had slurped down after his previous vomit session was now drowning the London sidewalk. Across the street lay the body of a young woman who had been deep into her pregnancy. She was on her side, facing Chris. His eyes froze on hers, wide with a look of sheer terror and pain. His eyes then drifted down her still body to the tiny hand that had punctured her belly and was now as dead as her, reaching out for help that never came. Chris thought of the poor soul whose mind jumped into that baby's body. The feeling of being trapped inside a womb was likely as powerful as being buried alive. They must have lost control and began clawing without thinking, without realizing that in doing so they were welcoming their own death. Or maybe that was exactly what they wanted, to be free of their new reality. The thought that this same fate may have befallen all pregnant women and their babies across the world would have emptied his stomach if it hadn't already been so. Finally, Chris tore his eyes away from the horror and made a pact with himself to never look back. As much as the sight of the dead bodies caused his stomach to crumble, the sight of the living wasn't much better. Most were having a difficult time processing all they were experiencing. They wandered the streets aimlessly until something or someone killed them, or they drifted out of Chris's line of sight. Others had taken to their new bodies with joy and were embracing the mayhem as an opportunity to cause even more. The rest were like Chris and Megan, aware and focused on survival. Still on the sidewalk outside of the high-rise while he and Megan figured out their next move, Chris watched in horror as someone in the body of a young girl who couldn't have been older than 6 approached someone in the body of an old man. The person in the old man's body hadn't quite comprehended what was happening and still saw nothing but a 6-year-old girl who needed help. Once she got close, though, she pulled the knife and stabbed him in the gut 3 times so fast he never knew what hit him. Once he fell to the ground, she jumped on him and started stabbing repeatedly. "What the fuck?" yelled Megan, raising her cricket bat. Before she could do anything, the young girl's head exploded and her lifeless body fell to the ground next to the corpse of the man she'd been stabbing. Standing about 10 feet away was someone in the body of a young man in his late teens. He was holding a shotgun, smoke still pouring from the barrel. He looked right at Chris, then Megan. "So, you two look normal." Megan and Chris exchanged glances and non-verbally decided to stand still. "English?" the young man asked. Chris and Megan both nodded. "Name's Carl. Would you believe that not 2 hours ago I was changing my grandkid's diaper? Now it's like I'm back in Nam." Chris and Megan once again exchanged glances. Chris took the initiative to reply. "Chris, North Carolina." "Megan, Wisconsin." "Look at us, a couple Americans in London. Can either y'all use a gun?" Megan hesitated, then shook her head. "I can," said Chris. "Good. Take this." He handed over a 9mm. "Might be a challenge at first, with your new frame, but I reckon you'll be okay." Chris took the gun, checked the clip and chamber, nodded in thanks to Carl, and asked, "Where do we go? Nothing looks safe." He wasn't wrong. There was smoke, fire, chaos, and rubble in every direction. The fire from the plane crash and the ensuing destruction had blocked their path in some directions entirely. I say we take 'em one of these cars and drive. Drive the hell out of here. The plan was so simple, yet among the madness, any option, regardless of how simple, was a good option. Works for me, said Chris. Using her gargantuan new arm, Megan blocked Chris from moving, then turned to Carl. Whoa, how do we know we can trust you? Serious? Said Carl. Just then, someone in the body of a man, roughly in his 20s and brandishing a knife, came running toward them, and Carl didn't hesitate to plant a shotgun shell in his chest, sending what was left of his body sprawling to the ground. That was enough for Chris. He placed both of his tiny new hands atop Megan's arm and pushed. I'm going with him. You should too. Safety in numbers. Megan didn't seem happy about it, but relented. Fine. Safety in numbers. Carl led the way, observing his comfort with the gun and how he confidently moved through the chaos. Chris thought about what he had just said about being back in Vietnam. Checks out, Chris thought. As Carl navigated the madness, he checked every car they passed. He was searching for the right one. Harder than it looked. Everything they passed was either too small, too damaged, or too full of corpses. They finally found the right one just over 2 blocks from where they began. Along the way, Carl shot 3 more people, and Megan began to crack someone's skull open with the cricket bat. Chris was more focused on protecting his new, smaller frame by staying between Carl and Megan. He pointed the 9mm at a few people, but never pulled the trigger. He probably should have at least twice, but he just wasn't ready to kill a human. It made him thankful to have a soldier like Carl around. Their new ride was an SUV. The driver's door was open and engine was still running. Whomever had jumped into the body of the driver had simply stopped, got out, and disappeared into the madness. Looking around before getting in, Chris was glad the mystery driver had made that choice. It was a perfect car for them. The trio of confused Americans got into the massive SUV with Carl behind the wheel. He peeled out and began tearing their way through the increasingly chaotic streets of London. If somebody got in their way, Carl drove through them. Eventually, the roads cleared, and the city began to disappear behind them. Where are we headed? Chris asked. Wherever people ain't. Chris's thoughts drifted towards his wife. If she was still alive and had the means, she would go home. If he managed to survive the chaos, that's where he was going to go. Chris was from a suburb of Cincinnati, but always told people he was from Cincy. He was perfectly average in most aspects of life. He had plenty of interests, but no passions. He had slightly above average intelligence, but wasn't exactly smart. He was a decent enough athlete to play football and wrestle all the way up until his knee injury. He would not have been good enough to attract an offer from even a Division III school had he stayed healthy. That was fine, though. He didn't have any real passion for sports. He liked them enough. Hitting people in football was fun. Pinning someone in wrestling was fun. They weren't the end-all be-all. The main reason he played sports, especially football, was it helped with girls. Another aspect of Chris that was perfectly average was his appearance. Not a heartthrob, but he was fit, with above-average height and a face you wouldn't mind waking up to. But when you're an athlete in high school, it bumps you up a few ranks in the social hierarchy, and Chris made the most of it. Then he met his future wife. She was a freshman when he was a senior. He never shied away from acknowledging it to be a bit creepy at the time, but once they both got out of high school and into their 20s, that gap became nothing. Most of his life he had planned on moving away for college, but with her in the picture, he stayed local. The only year they spent apart was her first year of college. She aspired to become a doctor and went to school in North Carolina while he finished up locally. Once he graduated, he moved east to be with her. They got a place together. He found a job with a local company and they made it work. Fast forward nearly 10 years and their relationship had evolved into what some people like to call relationship goals. It was all going according to plan, until it wasn't. Chris thought about all this while riding in the back seat as Carl drove. Carl and Megan were in the front seat discussing what was happening while Chris replayed he and his wife's relationship history and thought about how the only thing that mattered to him was staying alive and getting back to her. Get back to their home in North Carolina and their treasures. Arguably their favorite thing to do as a couple was to hunt for treasures, as they liked to call them. Essentially, they spent many weekends traveling around to antique shops, flea markets, rummage sales, and the like to find unique, interesting, and random items. They had filled a large portion of their home with these very treasures. There wasn't much wall space in the house that hadn't been covered by the shelves of antique bookcases, also acquired during their hunting trips, filled to varying degrees with these treasures. More than anything, Chris longed to someday be back in the States hunting treasures again with his wife. First, he had to survive this madness. Then he had to get home. Then he had to find her. How would they find each other assuming she was still alive in this strange and twisted new world? That was a good question. Luckily, there was a plan. Sometime in their early 20s, they had been out for one of her friend's birthday parties. Amidst the celebratory tomfoolery, they were separated. On top of that, her cell battery died. She was terrible about keeping it charged. So Chris ran out around downtown, popping in and out of every bar and restaurant looking for her and coming up empty-handed. He thought about going straight to the police. Then his phone rang. It was her. She was at home. Once she had realized they were separated, she went straight home to charge her phone and call him. After that incident, they made an agreement that in the event of an accidental separation, they would each go straight home. Simple as that. Can't find her? Go home. Can't find him? Go home. There were only 2 instances in the years following that the plan needed to be put into action. It worked both times. They got separated, they went home. It was foolproof. So, that was what he would do. Go home. Back to North Carolina. To their little house in a nice, quiet, gated community. He didn't know how he would do it or how long it would take. Months, maybe years. But he would eventually make his way across the Atlantic and across the United States until he reached their little house and hopefully find her waiting. He had no way of knowing where she was or if she was even alive. The one thing he knew was that if she was alive, no matter where she was thinking the same thing. Go home. They would drive until the car was nearly out of gas. Then Carl would siphon some from an abandoned car. There were more than enough options to choose from, even in the country. Then they would drive some more. Carl had taken them south out of the city, then west. There was no escape plan other than to get out. They had been lucky to escape. Carl had bobbed and weaved his way through the wreckage, often driving at a snail's pace, but he made it. They made it. The further they traveled away from the city, the more they could relax. There was still chaos. There was still wreckage. There were still people both alive and dead, but the terror was more spread out, whereas in the city it had been compressed and suffocating. There wasn't much talking. Carl and Megan's previous conversation had come to an end. Now everyone was lost in their own thoughts, trying to comprehend what had happened, what was happening. The only talking was Carl occasionally explaining his route choices. At one point, Megan casually remarked on how she was supposed to go to a football game later that day. When no one replied, she went back to admiring and analyzing her new tattoos. The right arm was the seasons. The shoulder was a fall scene centered around a large, imposing tree trunk with jack-o'-lanterns at its base and falling leaves that began to freeze and turn to ice just above the bicep. There, the winter scene began as everything turned to ice, with the centerpiece being a sinister-looking snowman. The ice began to crack just above the elbow and shatter into shards at the elbow. The ice shards then melted and turned to rain below the elbow, that evaporated and became flowing water in the shape of a wave being surfed by a surfer on Megan's new wrist. It was quite impressive. The left arm was space-themed. Didn't tell a story like the right arm. Instead, a large percentage of the arm was black and dotted with stars to represent the vastness of space. Planets, Moons, asteroids, galaxies, and spacecraft occupied the rest of the interstellar real estate. Chris quietly observed the tattoos from his place in the driver's side back seat, but chose not to comment. Megan looked to be in her own world and not interested in discussing her new skin art with her new companions. Chris supposed there would be time for conversations, pleasantries, and getting to know each other later. Eventually, Carl was able to get them off the beaten path as best as someone with zero knowledge of England's geography could. He found some back roads and took them into a secluded residential area littered with large houses behind solid gates. No one had any idea where they were since the internet and GPS were already down. They found themselves outside the gate of a large, nice-looking, and most importantly, secluded home. Even though it was gated, the gate was open, welcoming them to what looked like sanctuary. Carl drove through, then stopped so he and Megan could push the gate closed. He then parked the SUV in front of it for extra protection. If someone were to try and push the gate open, they would have to contend with the weight of the SUV keeping it shut. The house was large, but not massive, built of solid dark brick and stone, well kept despite its age. The yard was flawlessly manicured. It gave off a distinct old money vibe. Chris tried to guess how old it was. A couple 100 years for sure. It had that they don't make them like they used to feel about it. Strong and solid, built to last. Wondering how old the house was reminded Chris of something his wife had said about 2 years earlier while they were on a trip to Paris. It was right after the engagement became official. Everywhere they walked, she remarked on how old it all was and how young everything back home was by comparison. Having been to Philadelphia, she noted how aspects of the city of brotherly love were clearly inspired by French cafes, things Chris would not have noticed on his own. Thanks to her influence, it was the first thing he noticed while approaching this strange house that was to be his home, his shelter, for the immediate future. This house is probably older than America. It was there where he expected to form his plan for getting home. Even though he wanted to get moving as fast as possible, it was October, and he was in England. The air was already cool, plus the world was currently doing backflips. He was likely going to have to wait through the winter before leaving, maybe longer, which meant he could expect to be stuck in the house with Carl and Megan for at least the next 6 months. He didn't like it, but it could have been worse. It could have been much worse. A partial list of treasures Chris and his wife had accumulated over the years that he looked forward to one day getting back to. More than 30 different snow globes from various places throughout the world. Of the many locations depicted across the collection, Chris and his wife had been to only 1 or 2. The shelf they were kept on was nearly full. A bookcase filled with multiple copies of their favorite books. Anytime they saw a cheap copy of any of these books, they bought it. 2 more bookcases filled with cool and unique hardcover books. Some they had read, others they hadn't. Some they planned on reading someday. Some they didn't. They just liked the way they looked. They never paid more than $1 for a book unless it was one of their favorites. Then they would be willing to go as high as $2. An extremely random assortment of old, well-loved toys from the lines they had each enjoyed as kids. Shelves upon shelves of old watches, belt buckles, cameras, and pins. A collection of souvenir shot glasses that was comfortably in the triple digits, closer to 4 digits than to 2. More souvenir tchotchkes that other people had acquired during their travels only to discard later. Various old small statues carved of wood or cast of metal that were representations of a variety of things from people to animals, structures, and more. Thousands of matchbooks in various state of use. Not to be outdone, nearly as many vintage lighters as matchbooks. A copious amount of ashtrays, some with fun or interesting designs, others that were purely for function. Neither smoked. Close to 24 sets of billiard balls, hundreds of decks of playing cards, many with some sort of distinctive branding, an astounding number of fishing lures, but no rods or tackle boxes, plenty of old hammers, screwdrivers, and wrenches. Tools are one of the most commonly available items at sales, so they made sure to only get the cool antique pieces. Shelves of old physical media, including but not limited to VHS tapes, DVDs, CDs, vinyl records, laserdiscs, and video games. At least one copy of any board game worth having. Vintage and antiqued framed and frameable items, such as old concert posters, pieces of art, and even photography of strangers, most long dead. Far too much obsolete technology, including old cell phones, pagers, camcorders, and MP3 players. Did people, including their friends, family, and colleagues, often think their collection was strange? Yes. Most also found it charming and considered it a sign that they were meant to be together. That was how Chris had always seen it. Among the myriads of qualities that made him love his wife, her shared love of treasures and treasure hunting was, in his mind, definitive proof that they were soulmates. If there's one thing about soulmates, it's that they belong together, no matter what. The front door to the old estate was not only unlocked, it was partially open. This, combined with the gate being left open, led Carl to deduce that people had been there when everything changed over, and whomever had woken up in their bodies had fled. That's good. Should be empty. Even so, they agreed to be on their toes. Carl and Chris checked their firearms while Megan readied her cricket bat. The house was immaculate, exquisitely decorated with expensive art, furniture, and antiques. Much of it had likely been there for decades, even centuries. It was surely what old money people refer to as an ancestral home. One might even call it a manor. Chris couldn't help clocking which of the treasures he would like to take when he eventually left. He knew he'd likely not be able to take any. But it was a fun little game to play. He especially liked the antique chess set in the sunroom. The hand-carved pieces were exquisite, and the set itself was clearly very old. It struck him that he may not be able to take the whole set, but he could take a piece or two. No one would miss it. They checked all the rooms and found the house empty. There were signs of life, however. Ruffled sheets, damp sink, clothing sprinkled across the floor in one of the many bedrooms. It gave Chris the shivers. No one in the trio had eaten or drank anything since the madness began. Now that they were safe, they began to notice their collective hunger and thirst. So, after finishing their sweep of the house, they descended upon the well-stocked kitchen to help themselves to whatever they wanted. Chris was especially hungry after all the vomiting. Again, they found signs of the people who had woken up there after everything got mixed up. Dishes had been tossed into the sink without any concern for who would eventually wash them. One plate had shattered into several pieces. "Even threw their scraps in the trash," remarked Carl. "Yet smashed a plate in the sink," said Chris. "How thoughtful," added Megan. After dinner, they found themselves in the TV room. Carl was cradling a beer in one hand and a cigar in the other, while looking out the window admiring the backyard. Megan was examining the 9mm that Carl had given Chris back in London. Chris didn't remember seeing her pick it up. He had just set it on the counter while they ate. She must have picked it up after. But why? He was too tired to think about it now. Tired couldn't begin to describe his state. He was so exhausted he could barely stand. He started fantasizing about the beds he'd seen in the rooms upstairs. "You know, I think I could stay here for a while," said Carl. "Good," said Megan. Chris noticed the change in the tone of her voice, more serious and confident, a sinister undertone. Without another word, she raised the gun to the back of Carl's head and painted the window with its insides. Chris stumbled back and fell. Megan took a moment to bend over, pick Carl's cigar off the carpet, and take a puff before turning her attention to Chris. He raised his hands as if to say, "Don't shoot." She just laughed, then dropped the gun. "Not gonna shoot you." Chris let out a sigh, then began to stand only for her to deliver a bell-ringing blow to the side of his head. He fell to the ground, dazed, his head pounding. He watched as she removed her belt. What are you? She whipped his face with the non-buckle side. It stung like childhood. Although his father had only ever belted his legs. She whipped his face once more, then tossed the belt aside, and was instantly on top of him, tearing away his clothes. He was barely conscious. What? Megan, what's... Shut up. Name's not Megan. It's Mike. Had to improvise till we could get safe. You get it? But stop! A hard backhand across Chris's jaw severed 3 of his new teeth and left him barely conscious. Gasping for air, spitting the lost teeth out in a sprinkler shower of blood. Wanting to do this since I first laid eyes on you in this fucking body. God damn. Chris would have tried to struggle, but his new body was useless, especially in its current, tired, beaten, and weakened state. Within seconds, he felt it inside of him. There was nothing he could do. The male frame pressing down on top of his new, tiny female body was far too strong and heavy to fight off, especially with his arms pinned down. The only thing he could do was to close his eyes and think of better times. The day he met his wife. All the great times they spent together. Treasure hunting. The wedding. All the things they were supposed to do. He opened his eyes and saw pure rage staring back at him. It wasn't about pleasure to whomever was now living behind those eyes. It was about power. Chris closed his eyes again and thought about home. All he wanted was to go home, but he supposed he would never get the chance. He wanted to walk through that front gate and find his wife waiting for him. She'd be outside reading on the porch or doing work in the yard. She would look at him as if she had been expecting him, even with his new body. Then he remembered it would be her, but it also wouldn't be her. She would be in someone else's body. Would she even be attracted to the new him? Or he the new her? There was no point in wondering since he'd be dead soon. She may have already been dead. He would never get the chance to find out. Finally, mercifully, it was over. He did his best not to think about what was going on inside his new body while Megan, or Mike, whoever it was, stood up and put his pants back on and looped the belt back through the loops. Then he reclaimed Carl's cigar and began puffing. In between puffs, he spoke in a slow, measured, and confident tone, as if he had written and rehearsed his speech in advance. This is the new world, my friend. Belongs to the strong. In the old world, I was a small, weak loser. No friends, nothing to look forward to. Guys like this and girls like you laughed at me. Now look at me. He flexed his massive new tattooed arms. Now look at you. You'll never make it. Constantly running and hiding in fear of people like me. I'm doing you a favor. He kneeled back down with the gun in his hand. What are you gonna do? Asked Chris. Whatever I want. He raised the gun and smashed Chris across the face with it, severing more teeth and rendering him unconscious. Chris would eventually wake up, not for a few days. By then, Mike was long gone.